Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku had a quirk similar to Ghost's powers from Marvel, was forced to be the government's assassin during a mission he escapes, finds a new family with the Naruhodo vigilantes joining Crawler, Pop Step and Knuckleduster Lady Nagant, and Stain also joining as they go on a mission to save the world from a threat the heroes don't know about, as it's up to these 6 misfits to save the world. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The rain over Musutifa was a lie. It wasn't a cleansing torrent or a poetic drizzle, it was a cold, indifferent wash of gray that slicked the streets and blurred the neon-drenched skyline into a watercolor painting of urban decay. To the city, it was an inconvenience. To the asset-designated Phantom, it was cover. He moved through the downpour not as a boy of 16, but as a distortion in reality. A whisper of displaced air. To the naked eye, there was nothing. To a thermal camera, a fleeting cold spot. To the man speaking directly into his auditory nerve via a subcutaneous implant, he was a cursor on a map, a weapon moving towards its target. Status report, Phantom, a voice, devoid of warmth or inflection, echoed in his skull. It was the only voice he consistently heard, the only one that mattered. He called it Control. Izuku Midoriya, a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in a decade, didn't reply. He didn't need to. His vitals, his position, the ambient atmospheric pressure around him, all were relayed in a constant, silent stream of data to the sterile command center miles away. His silence was his report. All systems nominal. The tool was functioning as designed. His objective was the penthouse suite of the Kaibatek Tower, a monolith of black glass and steel that speared the bruised purple clouds. The target, Dr. Eris Thorne, a biogenetics researcher, and, according to the dossier uploaded directly into his memory, the charismatic leader of a radical anti-government faction known as the Serpent's Hand. He was accused of weaponizing quirk-enhancing formulas and selling them to villainous organizations. The mission was simple, final, and absolute. Neutralize the target. Erase the research. Leave no trace. The tower's security was a fortress. Pressure plates, laser grids, DNA scanners, and a platoon of corporate security armed with military-grade hardware. For Phantom, it was a sequence of trivial obstacles. He stood at the base of the tower, letting the rain plaster his tactical suit to his skin. The suit was a marvel of HPSC engineering, a weave of polymer and microservos that suppressed his thermal signature and housed the cocktail of chemical stabilizers that kept his volatile quirk in check. With a thought, he activated his primary ability. The world dissolved into a vibrating hum. The solid, rain-slicked pavement beneath his feet became a cold, ethereal mist. This was the first stage of quantum phasing, a decoupling from conventional physics. He sank into the ground, the concrete and rebar passing through his form like smoke. The sensation was always jarring. A full-body pins and needles accompanied by a profound, bone-deep cold. He descended through the foundation, past fiber-optic cables and plumbing, until he was aligned with the central elevator shaft. Then, he moved up. He rose through 20 floors in as many seconds, a ghost in the machine of the building. He saw the world in a strange, layered transparency, the shifting gears of the elevator, the skeletal structures of guards in their booths, the faint bioelectric auras of office workers finishing their late-night shifts, approaching level 47. Target's private lab. Security detail is heavy. Expect 2 4-man patrols and automated sentries. Proceed with level 2 invisibility. Control's voice was as steady as a surgeon's hand. Izuku didn't need the command. He was already bending light around his form, the world outside his personal field of vision warping and disappearing. He became a perfect void. He rose through the floor of the 47th level, emerging behind a large server bank. The air was cool and smelled of ozone. 2 guards stood by the reinforced door to the lab, their conversation a low murmur. Heard Thorne's been working on something big. HPSC is sniffing around. Let him sniff. He pays better. Phantom moved past them, his footsteps making no sound, his presence less than a memory. The lab door was an 8-inch slab of reinforced titanium with a biometric lock. He didn't bother with the lock. He simply placed his hand on the cold metal and pushed. His arm sank into the door up to his shoulder. He stepped forward, and the entire world shivered as he passed through the barrier, atom by atom. He was inside. The lab was a chaotic mess of brilliance. Holographic schematics of DNA helices hung in the air, glowing with soft blue light. Beakers bubbled with strange, colorful liquids. A whiteboard was covered in equations so complex they looked like a form of alien art. This was the den of a terrorist, the workshop of a man threatening the stability of the nation. It felt academic, lived in. A half-empty coffee mug sat on a desk next to a framed photo. His conditioning screamed at him to ignore it, to focus on the objective. But his eyes, for a flicker of a second, betrayed him. The photo was of a smiling man, presumably Thorn, with a woman and a small girl with bright, pigtail-adorned hair, all of them at an amusement park, ice cream smeared on the child's face. Phantom focus. Locate the target. Target is not in the lab. Biometric readings indicate he is in the adjacent residential suite. Control's voice was a sharp, corrective prod. Izuku pushed the image from his mind. It was a variable. Variables were dangerous. He moved toward the door connecting the lab to the penthouse apartment, his movements fluid and economical. He was a creature of efficiency, honed by a decade of brutal training that had stripped him of hesitation. He was a scalpel. He phased through the wall into the living area. It was opulent, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a god's-eye view of the city. A fire crackled in a modern hearth, and there, on a large sofa, was the target. Dr. Eris Thorn looked nothing like the severe, menacing man in the dossier. He was wearing a soft-looking sweater, his hair was disheveled, and his face was etched with exhaustion, not malice. A woman, the same from the photograph, was curled up beside him, her head on his shoulder. They rejected the appeal again, Thorn said, his voice heavy with defeat. The Hero Public Safety Commission. They said my research on quirk degradation was a threat to societal stability. They're seizing everything. The woman sat up, her expression a mixture of fear and anger. They're not seizing it, Eris. They're stealing it. You know that. Your work could cure degenerative quirk illnesses, help people whose bodies are being torn apart by their own powers. But because it doesn't create a bigger, flashier hero, they want to bury it, or weaponize it. Izuku froze mid-step, his invisibility a perfect cloak. His heart, a machine that had been beating at a steady, controlled 60 beats per minute, stuttered. This was not the conversation of a terrorist. Target is confirmed. He is with one unidentified female. Potential collateral. Await orders. Control's voice was cold, calculating probabilities. What are we going to do? The woman, Thorn's wife, asked, her voice trembling. They've already branded you a collaborator with villains in the media. No one will listen to us. We run, Thorn said, his voice firming with resolve. He took her hands. We take Emmy, we take the core data, and we disappear. I'll leak the research online anonymously. I won't let them turn my life's work into another weapon for their secret wars. Suddenly, a small voice piped up from the doorway. Are we going on a trip, Daddy? The little girl from the picture stood there, clutching a stuffed rabbit. She couldn't be more than 6 years old. She had her father's thoughtful eyes and her mother's warm smile. Thorn's entire demeanor softened. He opened his arms, and the girl ran into them. Yes, sweetie. A big adventure. We just have to pack. The world inside Izuku's head tilted on its axis. The neat, black and white lines of his mission bled into an ugly, incomprehensible gray. Quirk degradation. His own Fao called it quantum dissonance, a state where his body violently phased in and out of reality, causing excruciating pain and cellular damage. The HPSC controlled it with the suit, with the drugs, with the conditioning. They had told him it was a unique, incurable curse. Was Thorn's research a potential cure? Had they sent him here to kill the one man in the world who could fix him? To steal his work and ensure their weapon remained broken, and therefore, dependent? The dossier had been a lie. The mission was a lie. His entire existence, a carefully constructed falsehood to serve the very corruption Thorn was trying to expose. He wasn't a scalpel for justice. He was a hammer, brought down on anyone who threatened the HPSC's absolute power. Phantom, the situation has changed. The target's family is present. This is an unacceptable complication. A pause. Izuku could almost hear the clicking of keys, the soulless calculus of lives and objectives. New directive: eliminate all witnesses. The child is a variable that cannot be allowed to propagate. Confirm the order. The words slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. Eliminate all witnesses. He looked at the scene. The father holding his daughter, promising her an adventure. The mother watching them with love and fear. The little girl, Emmy, who was blissfully unaware that a ghost was standing 10 feet away, ordered to extinguish her life. His training screamed at him. Obey. An order is an order. Emotion is a liability. Hesitation is death. For 10 years, that had been his religion. But for the first time, another voice, a smaller, older voice from a life he barely remembered, whispered back. It was the voice of a little boy crying in a doctor's office, being told he was quirkless. The voice of that same boy watching a video of All Might saving people with a brilliant smile. A hero saves people. Phantom, confirm the order. I repeat, eliminate all witnesses. That is a direct command. Control's voice had lost its placid tone. It was now sharp, insistent, laced with the barest hint of a threat. Izuku's hands trembled. The stabilizers in his suit fought to counteract the sudden spike in his adrenaline and emotional distress, but it was like trying to dam a tsunami with a picket fence. A faint, almost imperceptible flicker ran through his body. The edges of his vision shimmered. Quantum dissonance. It was starting. No, he whispered. The word was alien on his tongue, rusty from a decade of disuse. It wasn't spoken into the comms. It was breathed into the air of the room, unheard by anyone but himself. What was that, Phantom? Your biofeedback is fluctuating. You are disobeying a direct order. This is your final warning. The family hadn't noticed him. They were still wrapped in their own world of fear and hope. Thorn stood up. I'll get the drives. You get Emmy's things. We leave in 10. He walked towards the lab, his path set to intersect directly with Izuku's invisible form. This was it. The moment of decision. Obey, and murder an innocent family, cementing his role as a monster. Or disobey, and declare war on the only people, the only world, he had ever known. Dr. Thorne was 2 steps away. Izuku made his choice. He let his invisibility drop. For a split second, he simply appeared in the middle of the lavish room, a boy clad in black, his face obscured by a sleek, featureless helmet, green eyes wide with a terror that mirrored their own. Thorne and his wife screamed. The doctor shoved his daughter behind him, shielding her with his body. Who are you? Izuku didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was locked tight. Asset has gone rogue. I repeat, Asset is rogue. Strike teams, converge on Phantom's location. Subdue and retrieve. Lethal force is authorized if necessary. Control's voice was a furious roar in his head, no longer a guide but a warden. Alarms blared throughout the tower. Red lights flashed. The lockdown sequence was beginning. He had to get them out. He had to get out. He raised a hand, not in aggression, but in a placating gesture. They lied? He managed to choke out, his voice hoarse. You have to run. Now, before anyone could react, the lab door behind him exploded inward, blown off its hinges by a shaped charge. 2 figures in heavy tactical gear, the same kind his support team wore, stormed in, rifles raised. Strike 1, target acquired. Izuku reacted on pure instinct. He grabbed the heavy marble coffee table and flung it at the agents, not with strength, but by partially phasing it into the floor to change its angle of momentum. It spun through the air, forcing them to dive for cover. Go! He yelled at the Thorns, pointing toward the balcony. He didn't wait to see if they listened. He phased through the floor, dropping into the level below, a deserted office space. He landed in a crouch, the pain in his cells flaring. The dissonance was getting worse. His left hand flickered, becoming momentarily transparent. He clenched it into a fist, forcing it back to solidity. Asset is on level 46. He is unstable. Use phase disruptor rounds. Box him in. Control was directing the hunt with cold fury. He sprinted through the office, weaving between cubicles. Another wall exploded. This time, 4 agents poured in, forming a classic pincer movement. They knew his tactics. They had trained him, after all. Phantom, stand down, and you will be recalibrated. One of the agents yelled. Recalibrated. The word chilled him more than any threat of death. It meant they would wipe his mind, amplify his conditioning, and bury this flicker of rebellion so deep he would never find it again. They would make him a perfect tool once more. He refused. He turned, not to fight, but to escape. He saw the window, the rain-swept city beyond. He ran towards it. The agents opened fire. The bullets were strange, emitting a low hum. Phase disruptors. They wouldn't kill him, but if they hit, they would forcibly solidify his phasing body, the molecular whiplash capable of tearing him apart from the inside. He dove, activating his intangibility mid-air. Most of the rounds passed harmlessly through him. But he was too slow, his control compromised by the dissonance. One round grazed his shoulder. The pain was incandescent. It wasn't a tear or a puncture, it was a violent, atomic rejection. It felt like his entire arm was being forced through a grinder while simultaneously being set on fire. He screamed, a raw, ragged sound he hadn't made since he was a child. He crashed through the window, tangible for a split second as the round did its work, and the shattered glass cut into his suit and skin. Then his quirk reasserted itself, and he was falling, intangible, through the night air. The pain in his shoulder was a raging bonfire, and the dissonance was feeding on it. His entire body began to flicker uncontrollably. One moment he was solid, the wind whipping at him. The next he was a ghost, the air passing through him. The sensation was nauseating, disorienting. He was falling, out of control, a broken toy cast from a great height. He had to get solid. He had to stop his fall. He focused, pushing through the agony, through the synaptic screaming of his rebelling cells. He fought for control, a battle waged on a quantum level. With a monumental effort, he forced his body back into a solid state just as he passed the roof of a much smaller, 10-story building. He hit the gravel-covered roof with a sickening crunch. The impact sent a fresh wave of agony through him, his injured shoulder screaming in protest. His leg bent at an unnatural angle. Broken. He could feel the jagged edge of bone pressing against the inside of his suit. Alarms and sirens echoed from the tower above. Searchlights began to cut through the rain. They were coming for him. He pushed himself up, his body a symphony of pain. Every nerve ending was on fire. His vision was blurring, the neon signs of the city smearing together. He ripped the helmet from his head, gasping for air that wasn't filtered, that didn't smell of recycled chemicals. The rain on his face was a shock, cold and real. He saw his reflection in a puddle, a pale, terrified boy with a wild mane of green hair and eyes filled with a desperate, hunted light. He stumbled to the edge of the roof, his broken leg dragging uselessly. He had to disappear. Not with his quirk, but in the old-fashioned way. He needed to get to the streets, to the alleys, to the shadows. He half-jumped, half fell to the fire escape on the side of the building, the impact jarring every injury. He clambered down the slick, metal rungs, his movements clumsy and agonizing. His body was flickering again, his control completely shot. His hand passed through a rung, and he nearly fell, catching himself at the last second. He finally reached the bottom, collapsing into a narrow, refuse-strewn alley. The stench of wet garbage and stale grease was overpowering. It was a world away from the sterile environments he was used to. It was real. It was freedom, and it was terrifying. The dissonance hit him with the force of a tidal wave. His body convulsed. The world dissolved into a nightmare of strobing light and screeching sound. He felt himself being pulled in 1,000 different directions at once. The feeling of the solid ground beneath him became unreliable, a suggestion rather than a fact. He was both there and not there, his molecules screaming as they were ripped between states of being. He saw flashes of his past. A sterile white room. The faceless trainers. The endless drills. The pain of the recalibration sessions after a failed exercise. The cold, empty praise after a successful mission. Control's voice, a constant, parasitic presence. And before that, a memory soul that felt like a dream. A woman with green hair like his, her arms wrapped around him. A warm, safe feeling. The word mom. The pain was too much. It was erasing him. He was a tool that had broken, and now he was grinding himself into dust. He crawled deeper into the alley, seeking the deepest shadows, propelled by a primal instinct to hide. His tactical suit, now torn and sputtering, was more of a cage than a help. Assets transponder is offline. Last known location: Naruhata District. Sweep the area. He is injured and unstable. Find him. Control's voice was a faint, distorted echo in his skull, the implant beginning to fail. Naruhata. He didn't know the name. It was just another part of the city, dark and forgotten. He collapsed behind a row of overflowing dumpsters, his body finally giving out. The last dregs of adrenaline faded, leaving only a universe of pain. His body was a chaotic light show, flickering in and out of existence like a faulty lamp. One moment, he was a solid boy, bleeding in an alley. The next, a semi-transparent phantom, the grimy brick wall visible through his torso. The rain passed through him, then pelted him, in an erratic, sickening rhythm. This was it. This was the end his creators had always warned him about. Uncontrolled dissonance. A complete breakdown of his physical form. He would simply, discorporate. Cease to be. His vision tunneled. The sounds of the city faded into a dull roar. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the blurry, neon-pink sign of a karaoke bar across the street, its cheerful glow a mocking contrast to the horror of his end. He was no longer Phantom, the HPSC's perfect weapon. He was just Izuku, a 16-year-old boy, broken and alone, dying in an alley in a city that didn't know he existed. And as his consciousness finally unraveled, a single, devastating thought surfaced from the wreckage of his mind. A hero saves people. He had saved the thorns. But he had failed to save himself. The rain continued its indifferent assault on Naruhata, washing the grime from the streets and pooling in the alley where the ghost of a boy lay flickering, caught between the world that was and the nothingness that waited to claim him. The city slept on, blissfully unaware that a tool had broken its chains, and in doing so, had unleashed a storm far greater than the one drenching its rooftops. A storm was coming for them all, and its first victim lay shivering in the dark, waiting for an end, or perhaps, a beginning. The night in Naruhata had a texture. It wasn't the sleek, polished dark of the city center, but a thick, grainy blackness that clung to the alleyways and settled in the hollows of its neglected architecture. Rain-slicked asphalt reflected the lurid pinks and electric blues of dive bars and pachinko parlors, creating a watercolor world of vibrant decay. It was on nights like this that Koichi Himawari felt most at home. Sliding to a halt on a thin layer of water, his worn sneakers squeaking in protest, he scanned the street. His crawler costume, a slightly too large all-might hoodie with the hood pulled up and a cheap motorcycle helmet, was hardly intimidating, but it was earnest. And in Naruhata, earnestness counted for something. Tonight's patrol had been quiet, blessedly so. He'd helped Mrs. Watanabe carry her groceries up 3 flights of stairs and prevented a territorial stray cat from accosting a delivery driver. It wasn't front-page heroics, but it was helping. It was enough. He was about to call it a night, dreaming of the half-eaten cup of instant yakisoba waiting for him, when he felt it. A strange, almost imperceptible thrum in the air. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling, like the static electricity before a lightning strike. It made the hairs on his arms stand up. His quirk, slide and glide, was simple, allowing him to slide over surfaces, but years of using it had made him sensitive to the subtle energies of his environment. He followed the sensation, his curiosity overriding his exhaustion. It led him down a narrow, reeking alley he usually avoided, a dead end choked with overflowing dumpsters and piles of sodden cardboard. The thrumming grew stronger here, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic strobing of light from behind the largest dumpster. It wasn't the steady flash of a police car or the warm glow of a lamp. It was erratic, unnatural. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding small against the backdrop of the city's hum. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" No response. Only the flicker of light, like a faulty neon sign. He held his breath and cautiously peered around the dumpster. What he saw made his brain stall, struggling to process the visual information. It was a boy. Or the impression of a boy. He was lying on his side, curled into a fetal position amidst the filth. He was clad in a torn, high-tech black suit that looked like something from a sci-fi movie, but that wasn't the strangest part. The boy himself was glitching. One moment, he was solid, his pale skin stark against the black suit, his messy green hair matted with rain and grime. The next, his form would shimmer and turn semi-transparent, the grimy brick wall of the alley visible through his torso. The light Koichi had seen was the energy discharge from these transitions, a soft, sickly green that pulsed with every painful flicker. Koichi stared, his mind racing through every quirk documentary he'd ever watched. A teleportation quirk gone wrong? Some kind of experimental invisibility tech? Whatever it was, the boy was clearly in agony. A low, pained whimper escaped his lips with every pulse, a sound of such profound suffering that it cut through Koichi's confusion and hit him straight in the heart. He took a step forward. "Hey, are you okay?" The boy didn't respond, his eyes closed, his face a mask of pain. A dark, ugly wound was visible on his shoulder, and one of his legs was bent at an angle that made Koichi wince in sympathy. This was way above his pay grade. Or it would be, if he had a pay grade. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers slick with rain. He had two contacts for this kind of situation. One was the police, the official, correct answer. The other was Knuckleduster. Given the boy's strange condition and military-grade gear, Koichi had a sinking feeling the police would only make things worse. He hit the speed dial for his grizzled, quirkless mentor. "What?" The voice that answered was pure gravel and impatience. "Knuckleduster? It's me. I've got a situation," Koichi said, his voice a rushed whisper. "In the alley behind the Golden Cat karaoke bar. There's a kid. He's flickering. I think his quirk is out of control. He's badly hurt." There was a pause, then a sigh that sounded like grinding rocks. "Flickering? Don't touch him. Could be contagious. Could be a trap. Stay put. I'm 5 minutes out." The line went dead. 5 minutes felt like an eternity. Koichi crouched near the boy, keeping a safe distance but unwilling to leave him alone. He felt a surge of empathy. To be young, hurt, and at the mercy of a power you couldn't control, it was a terrifying thought. He was so focused on the flickering boy that he didn't hear them approach until they were right behind him. "Whoa. You weren't kidding, Crawler," a bubbly voice said. Koichi jumped, turning to see Popstep, her usual vibrant costume muted by the alley's gloom, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and concern. Behind her stood the imposing silhouette of Knuckleduster. The man was a mountain of muscle and scars, his face set in a permanent scowl. He wasn't looking at the boy's injuries. His sharp, analytical gaze was fixed on the tactical suit. "That's not civilian gear," Knuckleduster grunted, his voice a low rumble. He took a step forward, his heavy boots crunching on broken glass. "That's military. Or HPSC Black Ops." He knelt, his movements surprisingly fluid for a man his size. He didn't touch the boy, but his eyes missed nothing: the strange insignia on the suit's collar, the port for a chemical feed near the neck, the specific weave of the polymer. "This is trouble, Koichi. The kind we don't walk away from." "But he's just a kid." "Pop," Kazuho Hanayama protested. She moved closer, her natural empathy overriding Knuckleduster's stern warning. "Look at him. He's hurt. We can't just leave him here." "I'm not saying we leave him for the crows," Knuckleduster retorted, his eyes still narrowed in assessment. "I'm saying we don't get involved. This kid is a loose thread from a government tapestry we don't want to unravel. You call an ambulance, anonymously, and we walk away. Let the professionals handle it." "The professionals are probably the ones who did this to him," Koichi argued, finding his voice. "And what if they're the ones looking for him? We'd be handing him right back to them." He looked from Knuckleduster's grim face to the boy's pained one. "We help people, right? That's what we do. This is a person. He needs help." Knuckleduster let out a long, frustrated breath, the cold air fogging in front of him. He looked at Koichi's determined face, then at Pop's pleading eyes. He was a pragmatist, a survivor who had learned the hard way that good intentions paved the road to the morgue. But he was outnumbered by the bleeding hearts he'd somehow ended up mentoring. "Fine," he snarled, the word ripped from him. "Fine. We move him. But if this comes back to bite us, it's on you, you idealistic brat." He pointed a thick, scarred finger at Koichi. And you, he added, gesturing to Pop, stop looking at him like a stray puppy. He could be a trained assassin for all we know. Pop bristled, but didn't argue. The decision was made. Moving him was a nightmare. His body's inconsistent state of being made getting a firm grip impossible. One moment, Knuckleduster's hands would find purchase on the tough fabric of the suit. The next, they would pass through the boy's shoulder as if it were smoke, the sudden lack of resistance nearly sending the big man tumbling. It's getting worse, Koichi noted, his voice tight with anxiety. The flickers were becoming faster, the periods of transparency lasting longer. His body's under extreme stress. The quirk's running wild, Knuckleduster analyzed grimly. We need to time it. Grab him when he's solid. Lift on my count. 1, 2, 3. On 3 they heaved. For a moment, the boy was fully corporeal, a dead weight in their arms. They managed to get him halfway to his feet before he phased again, his form shimmering. They stumbled, adjusting their grip. It was like trying to carry water in a sieve. Slowly, agonizingly, they half-carried, half-dragged him out of the alley and through the labyrinthine back streets of Narahata, a strange procession of misfits carrying a ghost. Their hideout was the furthest thing from a high-tech base of operations. It was the back room of a long-closed dry-cleaning business, a large, dusty space that perpetually smelled of mothballs and industrial solvent. A collection of mismatched, second-hand furniture formed a crude living area in one corner. A threadbare sofa, a wobbly coffee table, and a small, buzzing refrigerator. In another corner, Knuckleduster had set up a makeshift training area with a battered punching bag and a weight bench. It was humble, hidden, and for the three of them, it was home. They laid the boy down on the lumpy sofa, the only soft surface available. Pop immediately ran to get their first aid kit, a comically overstuffed box held together with duct tape. We need to get this suit off him to treat those wounds, she said, her voice practical now that they were in a relatively safe space. Knuckleduster shook his head. No. That suit might be the only thing keeping him stable. See that port? He pointed to the spot on the collar. Looks like a delivery system. Drugs, stabilizers, something to regulate his quirk. We take it off, he might discorporate completely. The thought sent a chill through the room. They could only watch, helpless, as the boy shivered and twitched on the couch, lost in a quantum nightmare. They did what little they could. Pop gently cleaned the grime from his face with a damp cloth, revealing pale, freckled cheeks and a jaw clenched tight with pain. Knuckleduster, surprisingly, was the one who addressed the broken leg, using his knowledge of street-level first aid to create a crude but effective splint, wrapping it carefully around the outside of the suit. Koichi just stood by, a useless sentinel, feeling the weight of his decision settle in his gut. They sat in silence for hours, the only sounds the hum of the old refrigerator, and the boy's shallow, ragged breaths. Pop eventually drifted off in a chair, her head lolling to one side. Koichi fought to stay awake, his eyes burning. Knuckleduster, ever vigilant, simply stood by the single grimy window, a statue watching the dawn begin to paint the Narahata sky in shades of gray and pale rose. It was in that quiet, liminal space between night and day that the boy woke up. Pain was the first reality. A white-hot, screaming agony that centered in his shoulder and his leg, but radiated through every cell in his body. The second reality was confusion. The pain was familiar, a constant companion, but the environment was wrong. His training, buried under layers of agony and exhaustion, clawed its way to the surface. He didn't open his eyes. First he listened. He heard the soft, rhythmic breathing of a person sleeping nearby. The low, electric hum of an old appliance. The distant, muted roar of city traffic. Nothing overtly hostile. No sterile silence of a med bay. No cold, clipped voices of handlers. Next, you smell? Not the sterile, antiseptic scent of a government facility. This was dust. And something faintly sweet, like cheap soap. And the unmistakable aroma of stale noodles. It was a chaotic, organic smell. A living smell. Finally, you see? He risked opening his eyes a fraction of an inch. The light was dim, filtered through a dirty window. He saw a cluttered, messy room. Mismatched furniture, a garish pop idol poster on the wall. A girl asleep in a chair. A tall, skinny man in a ridiculous hoodie, also dozing. Threat assessment: 2 potential hostiles, currently inert. Location: unknown, non-standard civilian dwelling. Status: compromised. Injured. Weapons system: quirk unstable. His mind, a weapon itself, began formulating a plan. Neutralize the immediate threats. Find an exit. Evade and escape. He tried to move, to push himself up, but his body betrayed him. The pain in his leg flared into a supernova, and a wave of dizziness washed over him. A choked gasp escaped his lips. His entire body flickered violently, the dissonance triggered by the spike of pain and adrenaline. The girl in the chair jolted awake at the sound. Her eyes, large and brown, widened in alarm, then softened with something he couldn't identify. Pity? Concern? They were useless, dangerous emotions. Hey, easy, she said, her voice soft. She started to get up. His training screamed. Hostile is mobile. Intercept. He tried to phase his hand through the couch to get leverage, but the effort sent another agonizing tremor through his system. He collapsed back onto the cushions, panting, his vision swimming. He was trapped. A weapon with no trigger, a ghost chained to a broken body. The girl stopped, seeing his panic. She held up her hands in a placating gesture. It's okay. We're not going to hurt you. He didn't believe her. Kindness was a tactic. A tool for manipulation. Control had taught him that. Identify the subject's weakness, trust, compassion, fear, and exploit it. What was her angle? She didn't press closer. Instead, she turned and walked over to the buzzing refrigerator, retrieving a glass and filling it with water from a pitcher. She approached him again, slowly, as if he were a feral animal. She didn't try to touch him. She just knelt down and placed the glass on the wobbly coffee table in front of the sofa. You look thirsty, she said simply. He stared at the glass. The water was clear. There were no visible sedatives, no dissolved compounds. But there could be tasteless, odorless agents. His life had been a cocktail of them. He didn't move. The girl, seeing his hesitation, seemed to understand. She went back to the fridge and got a carton of cheap-looking juice. She broke the seal in front of him, a clear sign it hadn't been tampered with, and poured some into a different glass. She placed that on the table as well. Then, she did something that completely short-circuited his tactical brain. She sat down on the floor, a few feet away, and just waited. She didn't interrogate him. She didn't threaten him. She just gave him space, her presence quiet and patient. His throat felt like sandpaper. He hadn't realized how dehydrated he was. The HPSC suit had a hydration system, but it had failed hours ago. Cautiously, his eyes darting between the girl and the sleeping man, he reached out a trembling hand. He ignored the juice, too many variables, and picked up the glass of water. His hand flickered, nearly passing through the glass. He gritted his teeth, focused, and forced it to remain solid. He brought the glass to his lips and drank. It was the most incredible thing he had ever tasted. It wasn't the sterile, mineral-stripped, recycled water from the suit's system. It was just water. Cold, and clean and real. It felt like he was dousing a fire that had been burning inside him for a decade. He drained the glass in seconds. The girl offered a small, tentative smile. My name's Kazuho, she said softly. The sleepy one over there is Koichi. He didn't reply. He just watched her, his mind a whirlwind of confusion. This wasn't an interrogation. This wasn't a containment procedure. This was kindness. Unconditional kindness. It was a foreign concept, a language he didn't speak. And it terrified him more than any weapon ever had. The kid's awake. The deep, gravelly voice cut through the quiet moment. Izuku's head snapped toward the source. The third hostile. The big one. He had been so focused on the girl and the sleeping man that he hadn't even registered the hulking figure standing like a gargoyle by the window. A colossal failure in situational awareness. His trainers would have had him on a pain inducer for a week for a mistake like that. Knuckleduster moved away from the window, his heavy presence sucking the air out of the room. Koichi and Pop were like house cats. This man was a panther. His eyes weren't soft and concerned. They were hard, intelligent, and analytical. They weren't looking at a boy. They were looking at a problem. He pulled over a metal folding chair, the sound of its legs scraping on the concrete floor setting Izuku's teeth on edge. He sat down, not too close, but near enough to dominate the space. He leaned forward, resting his thick forearms on his knees. "I'm only going to ask you this once," Knuckleduster said, his voice low and serious. "Who are you, and who's after you?" Izuku's jaw tightened. The answer was automatic, ingrained by years of brutal conditioning. Never reveal your designation. Never reveal your affiliation. Never speak unless ordered. Silence was his shield. Knuckleduster waited. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Pop looked nervous, glancing between the unmovable man and the terrified boy. "All right," Knuckleduster said, his voice dangerously calm. "Let's try a different way. That suit you're wearing is HPSC tech. Advanced prototype, by the looks of it. The kind they don't give to heroes. The kind they give to assets they don't want the public to know about. You've got the posture of a soldier, but you're a kid. You've been trained, and trained hard. I can see it in your eyes. So, let me rephrase, what project did you escape from?" Izuku's blood ran cold. The man was too perceptive. He wasn't just some back-alley vigilante. He knew things. He saw things. Izuku pressed his lips together, a thin white line. He stared at a point on the wall just past the man's shoulder, his expression a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. Knuckleduster sighed, a long, weary sound. He wasn't angry. He was something far more unsettling. He was grimly understanding. "Look, kid," he said, his voice losing some of its edge, replaced by a tone of gravelly resignation. "I've been around a long time. I've seen what the people in the shiny towers do to get what they want. They chew people up and spit them out. They find kids with powerful, unstable quirks, and they turn them into tools. Into weapons. They break you down and build you back up into what they want you to be, and they tell you it's for the greater good. Am I getting warm?" Every word was a hammer blow, shattering the carefully constructed walls of Izuku's conditioning. The man wasn't interrogating him. He was reading his entire life story from a handful of clues. Izuku's control finally snapped. A violent tremor racked his body. The half-empty glass on the table vibrated, then phased partially through the wood, spilling water before becoming solid again. He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting the wave of nausea and pain. "I see," Knuckleduster said softly, his eyes on the glitching glass. He looked back at the boy, and for the first time, Izuku saw something other than suspicion in the man's gaze. It was a deep, profound weariness. The look of a man who had seen the worst of the world and was no longer surprised by it. "He's not going to talk, Ueo," Pop whispered, using Knuckleduster's real name. "He's too scared." Knuckleduster, Ueo, didn't take his eyes off the boy. He saw the way Izuku flinched when he moved, the way his eyes tracked everyone in the room without seeming to, the faint, silvery scars that traced the boy's hairline, consistent with neural implant surgery. He saw the subtle signs of long-term malnutrition beneath the pallor of his skin. Pop saw a scared kid. Koichi saw a victim. Knuckleduster saw a survivor of a program designed to create monsters, and he saw the terrible cost of that survival. He stood up, the chair groaning in protest. "All right. No more questions." He looked down at the boy on the couch, his expression unreadable. "You're a heap of trouble we don't need. My head tells me to dump you on a hospital doorstep and walk away. But these two idiots," he hooked a thumb at Koichi and Pop, "have more heart than sense." He walked over to a locker and pulled out a thick, worn blanket. He tossed it onto the end of the sofa. "Here's the deal," he stated, his voice back to its commanding rumble. "You stay here. You rest. You eat what we give you. You don't try to run, and you don't cause any trouble. In return, we don't ask any more questions, and we make sure whoever is hunting you doesn't find you. When you're healed up, you can be on your way. We're clear?" Izuku stared at him, stunned into silence. It was a truce. A temporary sanctuary. It made no sense. They gained nothing from this. It was an illogical, tactically unsound decision. And yet, it was happening. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "Good," Knuckleduster grunted, seemingly satisfied. He turned to the others. Koichi, you're on watch. Pop, get him some actual food. Something solid. As Pop bustled over to a cabinet to find some instant rice, Koichi approached the sofa, a friendly, awkward smile on his face. Hey. Sorry about all that. He's intense. But he means well. He rubbed the back of his neck. Anyway, I'm Koichi Himawari. We already met, kinda. He gestured to Pop. And that's Kazuho Hanayama. Izuku looked at them. They had names. Real names. They weren't designations or code names. They were people. Kazuho brought over a warm bowl of rice, placing it on the table next to him. She didn't say anything, just gave him another small, encouraging smile before retreating to give him space. Koichi stood there for a moment longer. We don't know what to call you, he said gently. Do you have a name? The question hung in the air. A name. He had a designation, Phantom. Asset 734. The tool. But a name? He had to dig for it, deep into the recesses of a mind that had been systematically scrubbed and rewritten. He had to push past the firewalls of his conditioning, past the pain and the fear, to a place he hadn't visited in a decade. A memory surfaced, blurry and warm. A woman with green hair, smiling down at him. A small apartment filled with all-might merchandise. Her voice, a loving melody. Izuku. The name felt strange, like an ill-fitting coat. But it was his. The only thing they had never managed to take from him. To say it out loud would be the ultimate act of defiance. It would be an admission that the boy still existed beneath the assassin. His throat was still dry. He swallowed hard. Izuku, he whispered, the name a fragile, broken thing in the dusty air. My name is Izuku. A profound silence filled the room. Koichi's smile became genuine, brighter. Kazuho's expression softened even more. Even Knuckleduster, who was pretending not to listen, paused for a fraction of a second. For the first time in 10 years he wasn't Phantom. He was Izuku. And as he looked at the strange, mismatched trio who had offered him shelter, a new, terrifying, and utterly alien feeling began to bloom in the barren wasteland of his chest. It felt a little like hope. For 3 days, the world for Izuku shrank to the dimensions of a lumpy, threadbare sofa. It was a world defined by new, disorienting sensations. The taste of instant noodles, salty and artificial, yet profoundly more real than the nutrient paste he was used to. The rough, comforting weight of a wool blanket Knuckleduster had unceremoniously tossed at him. The sound of Pop step humming off-key to some sugary pop song on a small radio. His body was a prison of pain. The makeshift splint on his leg was a constant, throbbing reminder of his brokenness, and the disruptor wound on his shoulder burned with a cold, cellular fire that defied normal healing. The quantum dissonance had receded from its critical peak, but it remained a low hum beneath his skin, a sleeping beast that twitched every time he moved too fast or felt a spike of emotion. He spent most of his time in a state of forced stillness, observing. His conditioning demanded it. Analyze your environment. Identify threats. Ascertain the motives of your captors. But the data he gathered made no sense. His captors were laughably inept. Koichi would trip over his own feet at least twice a day. Pop would spend hours practicing dance moves in front of a cracked mirror, her concentration absolute. Knuckleduster, the only one who projected any real sense of danger, seemed more interested in methodically cleaning a set of custom-made knuckle dusters than in interrogating their prisoner. They fed him. They changed the dressing on his shoulder, Kazuho's touch surprisingly gentle and clinical. They asked for nothing in return. They argued amongst themselves about whose turn it was to buy groceries or why Koichi insisted on collecting every piece of limited edition all-might merchandise he could find. They lived. Their lives were messy, inefficient, and filled with illogical attachments. Izuku watched them, his mind a war zone. One part, the cold, analytical Phantom, catalogued their weaknesses. Koichi's naivete. Kazuho's emotional vulnerability. Knuckleduster's reliance on brute force. He formulated a dozen escape plans, calculating the precise moment to strike, the optimal path of egress. But another part of him, the buried, atrophied Izuku, was quietly fascinated. He watched Koichi patch a hole in his ridiculous hoodie with painstaking care. He saw Kazuho give half of her own dinner to a stray cat that frequented their alley. He listened to Knuckleduster give Koichi gruff, but surprisingly insightful, advice on his fighting stance. These actions served no tactical purpose. They were kind. And this kindness was a more insidious prison than any cell. It was chipping away at the foundation of his 10 years of training, leaving him feeling raw and exposed. He didn't know how to process it, so he retreated into the silence and stillness that had been his shield for a decade. He was a ghost in their home, present but not truly there, watching a life he could not comprehend. On the third night, the world outside their dusty sanctuary was stirring. 2 blocks away, a matte black, windowless van cruised to a silent stop. It bore no markings, its engine a low electric hum that was swallowed by the city's ambient noise. Inside, the atmosphere was cold and sterile. A team of 4 operators sat strapped into their seats, their faces hidden behind the same kind of featureless black helmets Izuku had once worn. They were Strike Team Gamma, the HPSC's premier asset recovery unit. Commander Valen stood before a bank of monitors, his face illuminated by their cold, blue light. He was a man carved from granite, his expression a permanent mask of grim efficiency. He had trained Phantom. He knew the asset's every trick, every psychological trigger, every flaw in his design. The asset's escape was a professional failure, and Valen was here to correct it. Quantum residue is spiking, a tech specialist reported, her voice flat. The asset is unstable, but contained. Residual signature is localized to that block. Specifically, a derelict commercial building. On the main screen, a thermal overlay of the building appeared. 3 distinct heat signatures were moving around inside. A 4th was stationary, its temperature fluctuating erratically. That's him, Valen stated, his voice devoid of doubt. The fluctuations are consistent with uncontrolled dissonance. He pointed to the other 3 signatures. Collateral, local vigilantes, according to the Narahata database. Codename, Crawler, Popstep, Knuckleduster. Amateurs. Irrelevant. He turned to his team, who had unstrapped and were now checking their weapons. Their rifles were different from standard-issue military hardware. Bulky, with cylindrical coils near the muzzle. Phase disruptors. Their belts held an array of specialized grenades and devices. Mission parameters are simple, Valen announced, his voice a low, commanding rasp. Infiltrate the structure. Neutralize the hostiles. Secure the asset. The use of SD7 sonic dampeners is authorized to disable the emitter-type quirk of the target Popstep. The asset is to be taken alive, but if it shows lethal resistance, your primary objective shifts to containment by any means necessary. We do not lose a billion-yen weapon system to a handful of back-alley thugs. Are we clear? A chorus of "Sir, yes, sir," answered him. Move out, Valen commanded. Maintain absolute silence. I want us in that room before they even know we're in the city. The van's side door slid open with a faint hiss. 4 black-clad figures melted into the rain-slicked shadows of Narahata, moving with a synchronized, predatory grace. They were hounds, and they had found the scent. Inside the hideout, the atmosphere was deceptively peaceful. Koichi was attempting to repair a faulty toaster, resulting in a series of comical sparks. Kazuho was listening to music on a pair of cheap headphones, quietly practicing a new dance routine. Izuku was on the sofa, feigning sleep, his senses on high alert. Something felt wrong. The ambient hum of the city had changed. It was a subtle shift, a frequency missing, a silence where there should be noise. Knuckleduster was the first to react. He was sharpening a combat knife, the rhythmic shing-shing of steel on stone the only consistent sound in the room. He suddenly stopped, his head tilted, like a wolf scenting a change in the wind. Koichi, he said, his voice a low growl. Kill the lights. Koichi looked up, confused. Huh! But I almost got the, now! Knuckleduster barked. The sheer command in his tone made Koichi flinch and immediately slapped the main circuit breaker. The room plunged into darkness, the only light now the faint, chaotic glow from the city outside filtering through the grimy window. Kazuho pulled her headphones off. Iwao? What's going on? Silence, he ordered, his voice a harsh whisper. He was already moving, his bulky frame surprisingly stealthy in the gloom. He peered through a sliver in the blinds. We've got company. 4 of them, rooftop opposite. They're not police. Izuku's blood turned to ice. They found me. The fragile sense of safety he hadn't even realized he'd started to feel shattered into a million pieces. The dissonance under his skin flared, a cold tremor running through his body. He was compromised, injured, his quirk a liability. They were all going to die because of him. What do they look like? Koichi whispered, his voice trembling slightly as he fumbled for his helmet. Black tactical gear. Featureless helmets. HPSC. Knuckleduster spat the acronym like a curse. They're here for the kid. A high-frequency whine, just at the edge of human hearing, began to fill the room. It was faint at first, then rapidly intensified, making their teeth ache. Izuku recognized it instantly. A sonic dampener, designed to disrupt emitter-type quirks and disorient targets. Kazuho cried out, clapping her hands over her ears. Her quirk, which relied on projecting kinetic force through rhythmic sound, was directly countered. I can't concentrate, she gasped, stumbling back. The window exploded inward. It wasn't a gunshot. The glass simply imploded, shattering into 1,000 pieces as a projectile fired from the opposite roof detonated, releasing a concussive but non-lethal blast of air. Through the now empty frame, 2 figures on zip lines shot across the alley, crashing through the wall of the adjacent room in a shower of plaster and splintered wood. Simultaneously, the main door to their hideout was kicked from its hinges with a single, brutal impact, revealing 2 more operators, disruptor rifles raised. They were boxed in. The attack was swift, precise, and perfectly executed. All targets, engage! A voice, amplified by a helmet speaker, commanded. The operators at the door opened fire. But they weren't aiming to kill. They fired at the floor in front of Koichi and Knuckleduster, the disruptor rounds impacting with a sickening thwump and releasing a burst of energy that made the air shimmer. Knuckleduster reacted with the speed of a cornered bear. Koichi, Pop, get the kid back. To the storage room. He grabbed the heavy, solid wood coffee table and heaved it, sending it skidding across the floor to provide a momentary sliver of cover. Koichi, his fear momentarily forgotten, snapped into action. He used his quirk, gliding low to the ground, and grabbed Kazuho, who was still disoriented by the sonic whine. He pulled her toward the back of the room where Izuku was struggling to sit up on the couch, his broken leg making the movement agonizing. The fight was a blur of chaos. Knuckleduster, immune to the quirk-dampening effects of the sonic field, was a force of nature. He met the 2 operators from the door head-on. He moved with a brutal economy of motion, his fists, reinforced by his signature weapon, striking like pistons. He was outmatched in terms of technology, but in raw, close-quarters combat, he was a master. He slammed one operator into a wall hard enough to crack the concrete, then ducked under a rifle but swung from the other, driving a powerful uppercut into his chest. But the operators were soldiers, not street thugs. They worked as a unit. As Knuckleduster engaged 2, the other 2 emerged from the hole in the wall, flanking him. One of them leveled his rifle not at Knuckleduster, but at Pop. "Owayo, look out!" Kazuho screamed. Knuckleduster saw the threat. He disengaged, roaring in fury, and threw himself in front of Kazuho, taking the full force of a disruptor round to his armored vest. The impact didn't penetrate, but the energy discharge threw him back several feet. He landed hard, the wind knocked out of him. From his position on the couch, Izuku watched the scene unfold with a horrifying sense of detachment. This was his world. This was the clinical, brutal efficiency he had been trained to deliver. He saw the operators' movements, recognized their formations, their tactics. They weren't trying to kill the vigilantes. They were neutralizing them, treating them as obstacles on the path to their objective. The objective was him. He watched Koichi, who had pushed Kazuho behind a stack of old tires, slide out from cover. Koichi wasn't a fighter like Knuckleduster. He was a skirmisher. He slid across the floor, his movements erratic and unpredictable, kicking at the operator's legs, trying to knock them off balance. He was fast, but he was hopelessly outmatched. An operator simply sidestepped a sliding kick and slammed the butt of his rifle into Koichi's side, sending him sprawling. "Asset is secure!" One of the operators yelled, his rifle now trained on Izuku. Prepare for extraction. Izuku stared down the barrel of the disruptor rifle. He knew what would come next. A sedative dart. A neural override. And then, the long, painful road to recalibration. They would strip away this brief, confusing flicker of freedom. They would erase the memory of a kind girl offering him a glass of water, of an earnest boy trying to fix a toaster, of a gruff man giving him a blanket. They would take Izuku and bury him forever, leaving only the perfect, obedient tool. The operator took a step forward. Behind him, Koichi was struggling to his feet, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. He looked at Izuku, his eyes wide with fear, not for himself, but for the boy on the couch. Get away from him! Koichi yelled, a stupid, heroic, and utterly futile cry of defiance. He launched himself at the operator again. The operator didn't even flinch. He simply turned his rifle and aimed it squarely at Koichi's chest. This time, Izuku could tell from his stance, from the slight adjustment of his grip, that it wouldn't be a warning shot. Time seemed to slow down. The image burned itself into Izuku's mind, Koichi, the well-meaning, clumsy hero who had found him, about to be executed for the simple act of showing compassion. Knuckleduster, pinned down by two other operators. Kazuho, helpless, her face a mask of terror. They had taken him in. A stranger, a ghost. They had protected him. Fought for him. And now they were going to die for him. His conditioning screamed at him, do not engage. Surrender. Comply. His training whispered, you are a tool. Your will is not your own. But a new voice, raw and furious, born in the fire of that moment, roared back, and oh, it was the voice of a boy who had seen an innocent family threatened. The voice of a boy who had tasted real water for the first time in a decade. The voice of a boy who had been given a name. The pain was a secondary concern. The dissonance was a distant storm. All that mattered was the image of Koichi about to die. Izuku pushed. He didn't push with his muscles. He pushed with his will, with every fiber of his being, against the very fabric of his own unstable reality. The dissonance flared, not as a random flicker, but as a controlled, directed surge of power. The pain was biblical, a feeling of being unmade and remade atom by atom, but he gritted his teeth and forced his way through it. He phased. He didn't just become intangible. He dropped through the lumpy sofa, through the dusty wooden floorboards beneath, a silent, instantaneous descent. The operator holding the rifle on Koichi hesitated for a split second, his target having vanished into thin air. That second was all Izuku needed. He solidified in the crawl space beneath the floor, his broken leg screaming in protest, then immediately phased upwards again, emerging directly behind the operator. His training provided a dozen ways to kill the man from this position. A phased hand through the chest to disrupt the heart. A precise strike to the base of the skull. A silent chokehold. He did none of them. Instead, he did something Phantom would never have done. He became solid and shoved the operator, hard. The man, caught completely by surprise, stumbled forward, his shot going wide, blasting a chunk of plaster from the far wall. Koichi scrambled back, his eyes wide with shock. Asset is mobile. He's fighting back. The shoved operator yelled into his comms. Izuku didn't wait. He phased through a nearby support pillar, the old wood a ghostly mist against his form, and reappeared next to the two operators who were pinning down Knuckleduster. One of them turned, raising his rifle. Izuku's hand darted out, not to strike, but to slap the side of the weapon. His hand was partially phased. It didn't move the gun so much as disrupt its internal mechanics. The rifle sparked and died with a pathetic fizz. The operator stared at his useless weapon in disbelief. That moment of hesitation was all Knuckleduster needed. With a roar, he surged to his feet, his massive frame a blur of motion. He delivered a brutal 1-2 combination that sent the operator with the dead rifle crashing into his partner. Kid! The sonic projector! Knuckleduster bellowed, pointing to a small, tripod-mounted device near the broken window that was emitting the high-frequency whine. Take it out, Izuku understood. He saw Kazuho still huddled on the ground, incapacitated. He ran, a painful, hobbling gait, and then phased, diving through a pile of crates. The remaining operator tracked him, firing disruptor rounds that passed harmlessly through his intangible form. But maintaining the phase while moving this much was tearing him apart. His vision swam. Black spots danced at the edges of his sight. His shoulder felt like it was being pulled apart by invisible hooks. He ignored it. He solidified next to the sonic projector and, with a desperate cry, slammed his fist into it. His knuckles met solid metal, but he pushed his quirk into the blow, just a fraction. His fist passed an inch into the device's casing before resolidifying. The complex electronics inside crunched and shattered. The high-frequency whine died instantly. The effect was immediate. Kazuho gasped, as if coming up for air. The pressure in the room vanished. Color seemed to flood back into her face. She looked up, her eyes blazing with fury. "My turn, you tinkin jerks!" she yelled. She clapped her hands together in a sharp, rhythmic beat, her body moving with the practiced grace of a dancer. With every clap, a pulse of shimmering pink energy shot from her hands. It wasn't a destructive force. It was pure kinetic impact. The first pulse slammed into the chest of the nearest operator, knocking him off his feet as if he'd been hit by a speeding car. The second hit the one fighting knuckleduster, sending him staggering back, his helmet cracking under the focused impact. The tide had turned. 2 operators were down, one was disarmed, and the last was facing the combined, chaotic fury of Crawler, Popstep, and Knuckleduster. The pristine, clinical operation had devolved into a messy, desperate brawl. Koichi, emboldened, was back in the fray, his sliding movements now a genuine threat as he disoriented the remaining operators' footing on the debris-strewn floor. From the comms and the downed operators' helmets, Valen's voice crackled, tight with fury. "Strike team, what is your status?" "Report." The final standing operator, seeing the situation was lost, made a tactical decision. "Mission compromised. Asset is hostile, collateral is effective. Retreating. I repeat, we are retreating." He threw down a smoke pellet. Thick, acrid smoke instantly filled the room, obscuring everything. When it cleared seconds later, the operators were gone. 2 had vanished back through the window, and the other 2 had dragged their downed comrades out the broken door. Silence descended, broken only by the ragged, panting breaths of the room's defenders. The hideout was a wreck. The door was gone, the window was a gaping hole, and the walls were pockmarked with weapons fire. Koichi, bruised and bleeding, pushed himself up. Kazuho was leaning against the wall, looking exhausted but triumphant. Knuckleduster stood in the center of the room, his knuckles bloody, his chest heaving. They were all looking at the same person. Izuku had collapsed. The moment the adrenaline faded, the monumental strain on his body caught up to him. He was on his knees, his body flickering so violently he looked like a bad hologram. The pain was beyond anything he had ever experienced. It felt like every connection between his cells was being severed and crudely reattached. He couldn't even scream. He could only tremble, his consciousness threatening to fray and dissolve completely. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was large, calloused, and surprisingly steady. He looked up through a haze of pain into Knuckleduster's grim, stoic face. "You did good, kid," the big man said. The words were simple, but they carried an ocean of weight. It wasn't the cold, empty objective complete he was used to. It was praise. Real, earned respect. Koichi and Kazuho rushed to his side, their faces etched with worry. "Are you okay?" "That was incredible," Koichi babbled, a mixture of awe and concern. "Don't talk, just breathe," Kazuho said, her voice soft as she knelt in front of him. "You protected us." He looked at their faces. Battered, bruised, but alive. He had done that. He hadn't been a tool. He hadn't been an assassin. He had been a shield. A guardian. A hero. The realization was a seismic shock, a fundamental rewriting of his own identity. The fight against his conditioning, the fight against the HPSC, it was all secondary. The real battle had been against himself, against the monster they had tried to create. And in this dusty, wrecked room, surrounded by these strange, wonderful misfits, he had finally won. Knuckleduster looked down at him, his expression serious. "They'll be back. With more men, and bigger guns. This place isn't safe anymore." He scanned the room, then his gaze settled back on the boy. "But we're all in this now. Together." He offered a hand to help Izuku up. It was a simple gesture, but it was an acceptance. An invitation. Izuku stared at the outstretched hand, then at the faces of Koichi and Kazuho. They weren't his captors. They weren't collateral. They were his to protect. They were family. He took Knuckleduster's hand, his own flickering form solidifying for a moment under the contact. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking with pain and an emotion so foreign he couldn't name it. He looked at each of them, meeting their eyes directly, no longer a ghost hiding in the shadows. "My name, it really is Izuku." The aftermath of the attack was a frantic, adrenaline-fueled scramble. Their sanctuary was irrevocably compromised. Every shadow in the alley outside felt like it held a sniper, every distant siren a prelude to another assault. They moved with the desperate urgency of a disturbed hornet's nest, grabbing only what was essential. For Koichi, it was a shoebox of limited edition All Might figures. For Pop, a worn duffel bag filled with costumes and music players. For Knuckleduster, a heavy, nondescript footlocker that clanked with the sound of metal on metal. Izuku, leaning heavily on Koichi for support, was a liability. Every step sent a jolt of agony through his broken leg, and the strain of the fight had left his quirk dangerously frayed at the edges. His fingers would occasionally turn transparent without his command, and a persistent, low-grade hum vibrated in his bones, the telltale sign of lingering quantum dissonance. He was a ticking time bomb, and he knew it. He was also their only reason for being hunted. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. Their new refuge was a place of last resort, a location Knuckleduster had clearly prepared for a worst-case scenario. It was a section of Naruhata's abandoned subway, a ghost network of tunnels sealed off from the public decades ago. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, cold steel, and forgotten time. Their footsteps echoed unnervingly in the vast, dark spaces. Their new home was a cavernous maintenance junction, surprisingly dry, with a single, bare bulb wired to a car battery providing a pool of stark, lonely light. "It's not much," Knuckleduster grunted, his voice echoing in the chamber. "But it's off every grid, and the only way in or out is through a sewer line 2 blocks away. They won't find us here, not with conventional tracking." The grim reality of their situation settled over them. They weren't plucky vigilantes anymore. They were fugitives, hiding underground like rats, hunted by a shadowy government agency with seemingly limitless resources. The mood was somber, the earlier adrenaline giving way to a bone-deep weariness. But in the center of their makeshift camp, on a dirty blanket spread over the dusty concrete, lay a glimmer of hope. Amidst the chaos of their escape, Knuckleduster had managed to retrieve a piece of salvage from one of the downed HPSC operators, a hardened datapad. Its casing cracked but its internal hardware seemingly intact. "If we want to stop running," Knuckleduster said, his voice a low growl as he stared at the device, "we need to know what we're running from. And what they're so afraid of this kid telling us." He looked at Izuku, his gaze intense. "This thing is our only key." For the next 2 days, the datapad became the center of their world. Getting into it was the first hurdle. It was locked down with HPSC-grade encryption that would make a corporate security expert weep. Koichi tried his hand at it, his usual optimism quickly turning to frustrated muttering. Pop tried to guess passwords based on popular hero birthdays. It was useless. "This is military spec," Knuckleduster eventually declared, taking the device. "You can't sweet-talk it. You have to break it," and so began his work. He produced a tangle of wires, a soldering iron, and a modified laptop from his footlocker, tools that seemed completely at odds with his brutish exterior. Izuku watched, fascinated. The man was a study in contrasts. A brawler who fought with his fists but thought like a chess master. He worked with a surgeon's focus, his large, scarred hands surprisingly delicate as he bypassed security chips and brute-forced his way past layers of digital defense. While Knuckleduster worked, a new dynamic formed within the small group. Their shared danger had forged a bond, fragile but real. Kazuho, seeing Izuku shiver in the damp cold of the tunnels, gave him her favorite oversized hoodie, a garish pink thing with rabbit ears that was ridiculously out of place on the former assassin. The gesture was so unhesitatingly kind it left Izuku speechless. Koichi, in an attempt to lighten the mood, would recount his heroic adventures, embellishing his minor deeds into epic tales. It was clumsy and transparent, but it was an effort. An effort to treat Izuku not as a weapon or a victim, but as one of them. Izuku, for his part, began to slowly, cautiously, open up. The silence that had been his armor for a decade began to crack. He would answer direct questions with short, clipped sentences. He explained the basics of his quirk, the constant pain, the dissonance. He spoke of his training in sterile, emotionless terms, but the horror of it hung in the air between his words. He was describing a life of relentless, systematized abuse, and the more he spoke, the more the others understood the stakes. They weren't just protecting a boy, they were protecting a soul that had been stolen and was now, tentatively, trying to find its way back. On the third day, Knuckleduster let out a triumphant grunt. "I'm in!" The three of them immediately crowded around the small laptop he'd wired to the datapad. Lines of code scrolled across the screen before resolving into a stark, black and red HPSC interface. It was a treasure trove of classified information, but most of it was locked behind biometric and location-based security protocols they couldn't hope to bypass. What Knuckleduster had accessed was the operator's local cache, mission logs, recent communications, and fragmented data packets. "Looking for anything related to the kid?" Knuckleduster muttered, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He typed in Izuku's designation, which the boy had reluctantly provided, Phantom. A file appeared. Project Phantom. Most of it was redacted or corrupted, but fragments were readable. Project Phantom Asset 734. Quirk, Quantum Phasing Unstable. Status Rogue. High Priority Retrieval. Handler, Commander Valen. Notes. Asset displays extreme cellular degradation, quantum dissonance, when not administered with redacted stabilizers. Volatility exacerbated by emotional distress. Asset is a cornerstone of redacted. Retrieval is paramount. Cornerstone of what? Koichi wondered aloud. Something they don't want anyone knowing about, Knuckleduster said grimly. He kept digging. He found the mission directive for their capture, listing them as hostile collateral. But then he found something else, buried in the encrypted comms logs from the day of Izuku's escape. It was a background intelligence packet, something the operators would have reviewed before their own mission. It was labeled with a single, ominous word, null. The file was heavily fragmented, a jigsaw puzzle of incomplete sentences and disconnected intelligence. Null collective activity detected in target Thorn's sector. Potential link between Thorn's research and Null's objectives. Procuring unstable power-up formulas. Source, Null Collective, High Threat, Anti-Quirk Ideology. Consider extreme sanction. Primary objective is to secure Thorn's research before Null can. Izuku's eyes widened. Thorn, that was the scientist they sent me to kill. He pieced it together, his mind, honed for tactical analysis, seeing the connections. The HPSC wasn't just after his research for themselves. They were trying to keep it away from this Null Collective. So we have 3 players. Knuckleduster summarized, leaning back from the screen. The HPSC, who created and are now hunting you. This Dr. Thorn, who was working on something they wanted, and this third group, the Null Collective, who wanted it too. We're caught in the middle of a shadow war we know nothing about. He cross-referenced the term Null Collective with a keyword search for Narahata. A single, recent entry popped up. A low-priority alert regarding a spike in black market activity, specifically, the sale of an unstable quirk-enhancing drug known as Trigger. The intelligence suggested the distribution point was somewhere in the industrial district on the edge of Narahata. It's a long shot, Knuckleduster said, his eyes gleaming with a hunter's light. But it's the only lead we've got. If we can find out what this Null Collective is, and what they're planning, we might find leverage. Something to make the HPSC back off. We'd be walking into the hornet's nest, Kazuho said, her voice laced with worry. We're already in the nest, Pop, Koichi replied, his expression unusually serious. The hornets just haven't found our little corner of it yet. I'm with Knuckleduster. It's better to fight back than to wait here to be found. They all looked at Izuku. It was his fight that had become theirs. The decision ultimately rested with him. He looked at the datapad, at the fragmented whispers of a conspiracy that had nearly cost him his life. He thought of Dr. Thorne and his family, and the lie he had almost fulfilled. Running and hiding would never change anything. He would always be the ghost, the tool. But if he could uncover this truth, if he could expose what was happening in the shadows, maybe he could finally become something else. He gave a firm, determined nod. Let's go find them. Miles away, in a city that ran on secrets and lies, another hunt was underway. Lady Nagant sat perched on a gargoyle atop an old, Gothic-style skyscraper, the wind whipping her two-tone hair around her face. Her rifle, an extension of her own body, rested comfortably in her arms. Below her, the city was a sprawling circuit board of light and motion. She wasn't looking at the city, however. She was listening. Her years within the HPSC, first as a celebrated hero and then as their secret enforcer, had given her access to networks the public could never imagine. Even now, disgraced and operating in the criminal underworld, her old contacts and backdoors remained. Rumors were currency in this world, and she was a master broker. The rumor that had caught her attention was that of a ghost in Narahata. A failed HPSC Black Ops raid. An asset gone rogue. And the most interesting detail, an asset with a phasing quirk. Her blood ran cold when she heard it. She remembered the whispers, the hushed, horrified conversations in the HPSC black sites she'd been forced to frequent. She remembered the files she'd accidentally glimpsed on a superior's desk, a project so secret, so monstrous, that even most high-level agents weren't aware of it. Project Phantom, a program to weaponize a child with a uniquely powerful and self-destructive quirk. They weren't just training a soldier, they were forging a living weapon out of a child's pain, using his own agonizing quirk as both the cage and the key. She had been a tool for the HPSC herself, her idealism twisted and broken until she became the very thing she'd sworn to fight. She saw a horrifying reflection of her own past in the whispers about this phantom. Another child being fed into the HPSC's meat grinder. The failed raid meant he had escaped. He was free for now, but Nagant knew her former masters. They didn't write off assets of that value. They would hunt him to the ends of the earth. She had a choice. She could ignore it, continue her own lonely crusade against the hero society that had betrayed her. Or she could intervene. Find the boy before the HPSC did. It wasn't about redemption. She was long past believing in such a thing. It was about something simpler, more visceral. It was about breaking one of their favorite toys so they could never use it to hurt anyone again. It was about offering a child the chance she never got, a chance to truly be free. Her investigation began. She moved through the underworld like a wraith, calling in old favors, applying pressure, using her fearsome reputation to loosen tongues. She learned about the collateral, the Narahata vigilantes. An interesting complication. She learned the code name, Phantom. Finally, she got a solid piece of intelligence. A source deep within the HPSC's logistics division, a man who owed her his life, fed her a critical piece of information. The HPSC wasn't just hunting their lost weapon. They were in a state of high alert over another matter, something deemed a Tier 1 existential threat. A group calling themselves the Null Collective, and according to the intel, the collective was making a move in Narahata's industrial sector, the same place their lost asset had last been sighted. The pieces clicked into place. The HPSC's hunt for the boy was tangled up in this greater threat. Perhaps the boy knew something. Perhaps he was the key. Nagant packed a single bag. She cleaned her rifle. Her face, as she looked at her reflection in the polished scope, was a mask of cold resolve. The HPSC had sent their hounds after the boy. It was time, she decided, to hunt the hounds. Her path was set. She was going to Narahata, in a different part of the same city, in a place far removed from both the desperate survival of the tunnels and the cold calculus of the rooftops. Another force was on the move. This force didn't care for secrets, or conspiracies. It cared only for its own warped, bloody ideology. Stain, the hero killer, knelt over the cooling bodies of 3 low-level villains in a filthy, rain-slicked alley. The coppery scent of blood mingled with the stench of garbage. He wiped his blade on the coat of one of the dead men, his serrated tongue darting out to taste a drop of their blood. He grimaced. Their conviction was weak, their motives pathetic. They were unworthy. Fakes, but they were not his primary target tonight. He was here because of what they were selling. Scattered around them were small, injector-type vials filled with a sickly green fluid. Trigger. He had been tracking this new drug for weeks. It promised a temporary but massive boost to a person's quirk. But it was a fool's bargain. The power it granted was unstable, chaotic. He had seen users whose quirks went haywire, their bodies twisting into grotesque parodies, their powers consuming them from within. To Stain, this was the ultimate heresy. A quirk was a part of a person's soul, a manifestation of their being. To treat it as a disposable commodity, to corrupt it with a synthetic booster for fleeting power, was an abomination. It was the ultimate expression of the fake society he so despised, a shortcut to power without the conviction or sacrifice that made one worthy of it. He had made it his personal mission to purge this poison and its source from the streets. He searched the bodies, his movements efficient and practiced. He found what he was looking for in the lead dealer's pocket, a burner phone. It was cheap, disposable, and hopefully, careless. He crushed it in his hand, extracting the SIM card. He had his own methods, his own network of terrified informants, and back-alley techies who would do what he wanted for fear of ending up on the end of his blade. He would find the source of this drug. He would find the people who dared to pervert the very nature of heroism. He slipped back into the shadows, a specter of righteous fury. His crusade had a new target. His hunt had led him to rumors of a mysterious organization that preached a doctrine of quirk purification through chaos. A group that saw quirks not as a gift, but as a societal cancer to be controlled or excised. They called themselves the Null Collective. Stain's lips curled into a snarl that was almost a smile. He didn't know their full philosophy, nor did he care. All he knew was that they were distributing a drug that created fake power, that perverted the natural order. In his rigid black and white worldview, they were a disease. And he was the cure. His informants gave him a location. A distribution hub, operating out of a supposedly abandoned warehouse in the industrial district of a forgotten corner of the city. A place called Narahata. The die was cast. 3 separate forces, each with their own desperate, violent, and deeply personal motivations, were now on a collision course. A group of accidental fugitives seeking answers, a disillusioned sniper seeking atonement, a fanatical killer seeking ideological purity. They were all being drawn, as if by an invisible string, to the same dark corner of the world. They were all hunting for whispers of Null, unaware that they were about to be caught in the opening salvos of a war for the very soul of their society. And at the center of it all, a broken boy with the power of a ghost was about to discover that he was far more than just a tool. He was a catalyst. The Narahata Industrial District was a skeleton. A sprawling boneyard of rust-red warehouses and silent smokestacks that stood like ancient tombstones against a bruised, polluted sky. By day, it was a place of grinding machinery and the shouts of overworked laborers. By night, it was a dead zone, a labyrinth of corrugated steel and broken asphalt where the only sounds were the wind whistling through shattered window panes and the distant growl of the city. It was the perfect place for secrets to fester. Their target was Warehouse 7, a colossal, decaying structure on the district's forgotten fringe. According to the fragmented data Knuckleduster had pulled, this was a primary distribution hub for the Null Collective's trigger drug. It was their only lead, a single, flickering candle in an oppressive darkness. The 4 of them huddled behind a stack of corroded shipping containers, the cold metal seeping through their clothes. The air smelled of rust, oil, and an unnerving, antiseptic chemical tang that grew stronger as they neared the warehouse. "All right, here's the plan," Knuckleduster said, his voice a low, rumbling whisper that was barely audible over the wind. "Simple recon. We do not engage. I repeat, we do not engage. Izuku, you're our eyes. Your quirk is our only real advantage here. Phase in, get a layout, count hostiles, identify what they're doing, and get out. Koichi, your lookout. Stay here, stay hidden. Pop, you're with me. We'll be the immediate backup if things go sideways." Izuku nodded, his expression grim. His leg was still a source of searing pain, wrapped tightly in a new, sturdier splint. He had protested coming, arguing that he was a liability, but Knuckleduster had been firm. "This is your fight, kid. You need to see it. And we need your eyes." The past few days in the subway tunnels had been a strange, accelerated healing process, not just for his body, but for his mind. The constant, low-level kindness of the others was like a slow-acting antidote to a decade of poison. He found himself speaking more, offering tactical suggestions based on his training. He was still quiet, still haunted, but the shell of Phantom was beginning to crack, revealing the thoughtful, analytical boy beneath. "Be careful," Kazuha whispered, her hand briefly touching his arm. The simple gesture sent a jolt of warmth through him, a stark contrast to the cold fear coiling in his stomach. He took a deep breath, the chemical smell stinging his nostrils, and focused. The world dissolved into its familiar, vibrating hum. He activated his invisibility first, bending light around his form until he was a ghost to the naked eye. Then, he pushed his quirk further, letting his body decouple from the physical world. He sank through the grimy asphalt, the sensation of pins and needles a familiar, unpleasant greeting. He moved underground, a silent, unseen current flowing beneath the warehouse. The structure was old, its foundation a maze of crumbling concrete and thick pipes. He rose slowly, cautiously, his head emerging through the floor in the darkest corner of the vast interior space. What he saw stopped his breath. This wasn't just a drug distribution hub. It was a laboratory. And a prison. The warehouse was a cavern of activity. The central area was dominated by complex machinery that hummed with a menacing energy, centrifuges, chemical processors, and a large, cylindrical containment unit that pulsed with a faint, sickly green light. Men in hazmat suits and armed guards in dark, featureless tactical gear patrolled the perimeter. They moved with a chilling, professional efficiency that reminded him of the HPSC operators. These were not common street thugs, but the most horrific sight was along the far wall. A row of reinforced cages, like those in a high-security zoo. And inside each cage was a person. They were civilians, kidnapped off the streets, their faces etched with terror and despair. Izuku could see the telltale signs, the missing persons posters he'd glimpsed on his first night in Narahata, the faces now here in the flesh. In the center of the room, a man in a pristine white lab coat, his face cold and imperious, directed the operation. He held a clipboard and monitored a series of terminals. "Subject 12 is prepped," a guard announced. "Ready for infusion." 2 guards dragged a struggling man from one of the cages. He was crying, begging for his life. "Please, I have a family. Don't do this. Your sacrifice will serve a greater purpose," the man in the lab coat said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You will help us demonstrate the inherent cancer of the quirk phenomenon. A cure often requires radical, painful treatment." They strapped the man to a heavy steel chair in the center of the room. A tube connected to the large containment unit was attached to a port in his arm. "Begin the infusion of the unstable solution," the scientist commanded. "Let's observe the degradation process." Izuku watched in abject horror as the green fluid from the containment unit was pumped into the man's arm. The man screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. His body began to convulse violently. His quirk, whatever it was, erupted from him in an uncontrolled, monstrous display. His skin began to bubble and stretch, sprouting jagged, crystalline growths. His eyes glowed with a malevolent, green light. He was no longer a person. He was a monster, a living embodiment of a quirk gone haywire, a screaming testament to the Null Collective's horrific science. "They're not just making a drug," Izuku realized, a wave of nausea washing over him. "They're weaponizing it. They're turning people into living bombs." This was their research. He had seen enough. This was no longer a recon mission. People were going to die. He sank back through the floor, his mind racing, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and righteous fury. He re-emerged behind the shipping containers, his invisibility dropping as he gasped for air. The horrific images burned into his mind. "They're killing them," he choked out, his voice ragged. "It's not a drug lab, it's a torture chamber. They're experimenting on kidnapped civilians, forcing their quirks to go berserk." Knuckleduster's face, already grim, hardened into a mask of cold fury. Kazuho's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Koichi's goofy demeanor vanished, replaced by a steely resolve Izuku had never seen before. "The plan has changed," Knuckleduster growled. "We're not leaving. We're getting those people out." "But how?" Koichi asked, his voice shaking but firm. "There must be 20 armed guards in there, not to mention that monster." "We create a diversion," Izuku said, his tactical mind taking over. "A big one. Something to draw the guards away from the cages. Once they're clear, I can phase the locks. Koichi, you're the fastest. You get the civilians out. Kazuho, you and Knuckleduster provide cover." It was a desperate, suicidal plan, and they all knew it. They were 4 vigilantes against a small army. But as they looked at each other in the gloom, a silent agreement passed between them. They couldn't walk away. "Not now. I'll be the diversion," Knuckleduster said, cracking his knuckles. "They won't be expecting a frontal assault." "No," Izuku countered immediately. "They'll gun you down before you get 10 feet. The diversion has to be something they can't predict. It has to be me." He looked at them, his green eyes burning with an intensity they hadn't seen before. "I can get in and out. I can cause chaos. It's the only way." Before anyone could argue, the decision was taken out of their hands. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the industrial park, impossibly loud in the night's silence. It wasn't an explosion. It was the sound of a high-velocity round breaking the sound barrier. A split second later, a small, fist-sized hole appeared in the upper corner of the warehouse's metal wall, glowing cherry red at the edges. The bullet, whatever it was, had punched through a foot of solid steel as if it were tissue paper. Alarms blared from within the warehouse. The hum of machinery sputtered and died. The guards inside shouted in confusion. "What was that?" Kazuho whispered, startled. "A sniper," Knuckleduster grunted, his eyes scanning the rooftops of the surrounding buildings. "And a damn good one. That shot came from at least a mile away." They took out the main power conduit. From her perch on a distant communications tower, Lady Nagant allowed herself a small, grim smile. She chambered another round, a specialized armor-piercing shell she'd crafted herself. The HPSC had taught her how to be a scalpel. The underworld had taught her how to be a sledgehammer. Tonight she was both. Her intel had been correct. The Null Collective was here. But she'd also detected the faint energy signature of the Narahata vigilantes nearby. They were about to stumble into a slaughterhouse. She could have let it happen, waited for the pieces to fall. But that wasn't her style. She preferred to rearrange the board herself. Her shot wasn't just to cripple the facility. It was an announcement. The game has changed. Inside the warehouse, chaos erupted. The emergency lights flickered on, casting the scene in an eerie red glow. The monstrously transformed civilian, no longer restrained by the energy fields of the chair, broke free with a horrifying shriek and began rampaging through the lab, smashing equipment and lashing out at anything that moved. External threat detected. The lead scientist yelled into a comm unit. "All security teams, secure the perimeter. Find that sniper." Half of the guards, a dozen men, poured out of the warehouse's main entrance, fanning out into the yard, their rifles sweeping the darkness. "Now's our chance!" Knuckleduster roared. "Go! Go! Go!" They broke cover. Knuckleduster and Kazuho charged toward a side entrance, while Koichi and Izuku made for the loading bay, its large door now partially open as the guards had exited. But they weren't the only ones taking advantage of the chaos. As the guards exited the front, a dark, terrifying figure dropped from the warehouse rafters into their midst. He moved with a preternatural speed and grace, a tattered red scarf flowing behind him like a trail of blood. In his hands he held a collection of blades, and his face was a nightmare of missing flesh and manic, burning eyes. It was Stain. "You peddlers of false strength," he hissed, his voice a venomous rasp. "Your very existence is an insult to the idea of heroism. You are a cancer. And I am the surgeon's blade." The guards, caught completely off guard, barely had time to raise their weapons. Stain was a whirlwind of death. He flowed between them, his blades a blur. He didn't just kill, he fought with a terrifying, intimate brutality. He would slice a hamstring, lick the blood from his blade to activate his quirk, and leave his paralyzed victim for a more permanent, bloody end later. He was a force of nature, a one-man army of fanatical conviction. The professional, disciplined guards of the Null Collective broke and scattered in terror before him. The Narahata crews saw the massacre unfolding as they reached the side of the building. "Is that Is that the hero killer? Koichi stammered, his blood running cold. Forget him. The mission is the civilians. Knuckleduster yelled, kicking open a rusted service door. They poured inside, finding themselves in the midst of pandemonium. The lights were flashing red, alarms were blaring, and the mutated civilian was still on a rampage, throwing guards around like dolls. The remaining security was desperately trying to contain both the monster and the chaos from the sniper attack. They barely even noticed the 4 vigilantes slip in amidst the confusion. Izuku, the cages. Now! Knuckleduster commanded. Izuku didn't hesitate. He became intangible, a ghost gliding through the chaos. The guards were too distracted to notice the flicker of displaced air. He reached the cages, where the civilians were huddled together, screaming in terror. The locks were heavy, electronic maglocks. He simply passed his hand through them, disrupting their mechanisms. One by one, the cage doors swung open. Come on! This way! Koichi yelled, waving his arms, his bright hoodie a beacon of hope in the red-tinged darkness. Hurry! The civilians, seeing a chance at escape, began to pour out of the cages, a panicked, stumbling herd. Kazuho and Knuckleduster provided cover. A guard turned, his rifle swinging towards the escaping civilians. Kazuho clapped her hands, and a pulse of kinetic energy slammed into him, sending him flying. Knuckleduster waded into a group of 3 guards, his fists a blur of controlled violence, clearing a path. The operation was working. It was messy, it was chaotic, but it was working. And then it all went wrong. The lead scientist, seeing his experiment and his prisoners escaping, let out a scream of pure fury. You will not ruin my work! Containment Protocol Omega. He slammed his hand down on a large, red button on his console. Heavy steel shutters slammed down over all the exits, sealing them inside. The blaring alarms cut off, replaced by a low, menacing hum. The red emergency lights switched to a sterile, terrifying white. The mutated creature, which had been rampaging mindlessly, suddenly froze. It let out a low gurgle, and the crystalline growths on its body began to glow with an intense, unstable energy. What's happening? Pop cried out. Izuku, his mind processing the tactical situation, realized their horrific plan. It's a fail-safe. They're going to overload him. He's going to explode. It's a bomb. They're going to sanitize the entire facility. Panic erupted. The civilians screamed, pressing against the sealed exits. The remaining no guards, realizing they had been sacrificed by their leader, looked just as terrified. Outside, Stain finished his bloody work. The last of the external guards was paralyzed, bleeding out on the asphalt. He turned his fanatical gaze to the now sealed warehouse. He could feel it. The source of the poison was inside. He ran toward the massive steel door, his blades scraping against the metal, seeking a way in. On her distant perch, Nagant saw the shutters descend. Her thermal scope showed the energy signature of the mutated civilian spiking to critical levels. A self-destruct, she muttered, her lips a thin line, crude but effective. The boy, the phantom, was inside. She couldn't let her potential key to freeing herself from her past be vaporized. She adjusted her aim. Her target was no longer a power conduit. It was the massive hinge mechanism on the main loading bay door. She took a breath, her heartbeat slowing, the world narrowing to the space between her eye and the scope. She fired. The second shot was even more powerful than the first. The specialized round, a kinetic penetrator of her own design, screamed across the night and slammed into the hinge. The sound was like the ringing of a colossal bell. The hinge, inches of reinforced steel, buckled and tore. The massive door, its primary support gone, slumped sideways, creating a gap just large enough for a person to squeeze through. Stain, who had been about to try and cut his way in, saw the opening and didn't hesitate. He slipped through the gap, a predator entering a cage of chaos. Inside, the situation was desperate. The mutated creature was pulsing like a grotesque heart, the light it was emitting growing brighter and brighter. We have maybe 30 seconds. Izuku yelled over the creature's high-pitched whine. Everyone to the main door. He looked over and saw the scientist, the man responsible for it all, calmly gathering a briefcase of data drives, clearly intending to escape through a hidden, personal exit. A cold fury, purer and more focused than any he'd ever felt, seized Izuku. He phased through the floor, a maneuver that sent a fresh wave of agony up his broken leg, and re-emerged directly in the scientist's path. "You're not going anywhere," Izuku snarled, his voice a low growl. The scientist looked at him, not with fear, but with a chilling, academic curiosity. "Ah, the anomaly. The HPSC's ghost. Your quirk, it is a beautiful example of the entropic decay we predict. You are the perfect proof of our thesis." Before Izuku could react, 2 of the remaining guards, loyal to the last, opened fire on him. Izuku went intangible, the disruptor rounds passing through him. But the distraction was enough. The scientist made a break for a small, reinforced door in the wall. Suddenly, a blade whistled through the air and embedded itself in the wall inches from the scientist's head. The scientist froze, turning to see the blood-soaked form of Stain standing there, his eyes burning with cold fire. "The source of the poison," Stain hissed. "You will answer for your heresy." A 3-way standoff. Izuku, intangible, watching the scene. Stain, ready to kill. The scientist, trapped between them. The creature behind them let out a final, piercing shriek. The light it was emitting turned pure white. "We have to go now," Knuckleduster bellowed, shoving the last of the terrified civilians through the gap in the broken door. Koichi and Kazuho were right behind them, turning to yell for their friends. Stain glanced from the scientist to the imminent explosion. His twisted code demanded he purge the fake, but survival was a prerequisite. He made a tactical decision. With blinding speed, he lunged forward, not to kill the scientist, but to slam the hilt of his katana into the man's temple. The scientist crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Stain grabbed the man's briefcase of data. "The knowledge of your poison is more valuable than your life, for now," he snarled, before turning to flee. Izuku solidified, grabbing the unconscious scientist's arm. He wouldn't let him die, but he wouldn't let him escape either. He began to drag the man toward the exit. The 3 of them, Izuku dragging the scientist, Stain clutching the briefcase, and Knuckleduster providing cover, reached the broken door just as the world turned white. The explosion was not a typical fiery blast. It was a silent, concussive wave of pure energy. A quirk detonation. The warehouse didn't explode outwards. It imploded, the metal walls groaning and collapsing in on the epicenter of the blast. The wave of energy washed over them, throwing them clear of the collapsing structure. They landed in a heap on the asphalt, bruised, battered, and deafened. The warehouse behind them was a twisted, smoking wreck, a tomb of corrugated steel. They had survived. They had saved the civilians, but they were far from safe. As the ringing in their ears subsided, they became aware of their new reality. The Naruhata vigilantes, Koichi, Kazuho, and Knuckleduster, stood panting, staring at their unlikely and terrifying new allies. There was Izuku, the ghost boy, holding the unconscious architect of the night's horrors. And there was Stain, the infamous hero killer, his clothes soaked in blood, his eyes glowing with undiminished fanaticism, clutching a briefcase of secrets. A tense, heavy silence fell over the group. They were all after the same enemy, but for wildly different reasons. They were a collection of broken tools, shattered ideals, and raw conviction. From the shadows near the edge of the industrial park, a figure emerged. She walked with a confident, deliberate stride, her rifle held loosely at her side. Her long, two-toned hair flowed in the wind from the explosion's aftermath. Lady Nagant had arrived. She stopped 100 feet away, her sharp eyes taking in the entire scene. The vigilantes, the boy, the hero killer, the unconscious scientist. "Well," she said, her voice carrying easily in the sudden silence, a dry, cynical amusement lacing her tone. "This has turned into a party." The standoff was complete. 6 outcasts, survivors of a battle the world would never know about, stood in the ruins of their common enemy's lair. They were not friends. They were barely allies. They were a collection of jagged, broken pieces. But the threat of the Null Collective was far from over, and in the smoky, acrid air of the Naruhata night, it was becoming clear that these misfits might be the only ones who could put the pieces together to save a world that had rejected every single one of them.